All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the system-wide program for the Eastern Oklahoma Library System, and my name is Cherokee Lowe, and I am the shared branch manager of 2 of the libraries in the system out of the 15. And we are here with Mike Korenblit, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, and then we will start the presentation. Mike is a graduate of the University of Oklahoma with a bachelor's degree in education and political science. He worked 19 years for the Close-Up Foundation, an educational organization in Washington, D.C. He directed Close-Up's television and video department, where he produced the ACE award-winning television series, which aired on the cable satellite public affairs network. He produced numerous award-winning documentaries, including Democracy and Rights, about the 1957 desegregation of Little Rock High School. He is also the co-founder of the Respect Diversity Foundation, a nonprofit tax-exempt educational organization which is founded to teach respect, tolerance, and acceptance for all people. RDF has a Speakers Bureau of educators who are civil rights leaders, human rights advocates, Holocaust educators, visual artists, musicians, early childhood educators, and more. Through RDF's Speakers Bureau and numerous programs, educators work with students, teachers, and community organizations throughout the state. Since its founding in 2001, RDF has worked with over 300,000 students, teachers, and adults. Michael is also the co-author of the best-selling book, Until We Meet Again, The True Story of Love and Survival in the Holocaust, which is what we will be discussing today. So now I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Welcome.
Thank you, Cherokee, very much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. As was mentioned by Cherokee, we founded the Respect Diversity Foundation in 2001, and the reason we started it was because of my own family's background, and I'm going to share their background, share their story with you as I go through it. I will talk about how what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is relevant to what is going on in the world today. When I was 6 years old, sitting in the living room with my parents, that's them right there. That was taken in 1946 after the war in Germany. And I noticed something on my parents' wrist. It was a K and an L in blue ink. And on the inside of my mother's forearm was the letter A followed by the number 27327. And being the inquisitive little people we are at that age, I asked my parents what those were. And they tried to explain to me in the least horrifying and the simplest of terms that they were both survivors of the Holocaust. Needless to say, I didn't understand a lot of it at that time, but eventually I would. I want to start off by a map here. The estimates are somewhere between 3.5 million and 6.2 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And what you see there now is a map of Europe. And the numbers that you see on there with the countries are the number of Jews that were murdered in each of those countries. The largest that you can see, 4 million right here, Poland, the 4,500,000, that's Poland and western part of the USSR at the time. You can see the numbers on all the countries there, but I want to point out 3 countries specifically because of something that happened. The first one is Denmark. And you notice the number, it says 120. So you think, well, must not have had many Jews that lived in Denmark. That's not quite accurate for their population. Denmark had a Jewish population of about 7,800 Jews in the small little country there. When the Nazis took it over, they initiated the same laws in Denmark that they had initiated everywhere else against the Jews. But Denmark had a very vibrant underground. And when the orders came down, when they knew that the orders were coming down, that they were going to start deporting the Jews of Denmark, the underground went into operation. And what they ended up doing was going to every Jewish home in Denmark and told them where to be at what time. And at that time and the location, what they did with every kind of floating vehicle that you can imagine, from ships to fishing vessels to rowboats, what they did is they ferried all the Jews across from Denmark into neutral Sweden. Only 500 of them were not able to go. They were mostly the very elderly or very sick people who could not make the trip. But what Denmark did is, because the Nazis ended up deporting those 500 Jews to the camps is the Danes did something that very few other people did, actually no other country did, is they followed where those Jews were sent. And they made sure they got special Red Cross packages with food and medical supplies and other necessities. And that is why only 120 Jews ended up dying out of those 7,800 Jews of Denmark. So that's a real tribute to the Danes. The next country I want to point out is down at the bottom there, the country of Bulgaria. Bulgaria, you might think, didn't have a large population of Jews. Not true. They had a population of over 55,000 Jews who lived in Bulgaria. Bulgaria was a very anti-Semitic country. Actually, they initiated anti-Jewish laws in Bulgaria before the Nazis even initiated them. They were an ally of the Nazis. They fought with the Nazis in World War II. So when the Nazis ordered the Bulgarian government to start rounding up their Jews, the second in command, or the second in leadership in the Bulgarian parliament, said, no, we're not going to do that. And they had a huge debate in the parliament about whether they should abide by the Nazis' order to round up the Jews and start deporting them. They finally took a vote, and the person and his allies who said no lost that vote, and they were thrown out of the parliament, and the rest of the legislature voted, and they voted yes, that they would start deporting the Jews. However, something else happened with the Bulgarian people that they didn't count on. And the Bulgarian people rose up and said, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. There are even stories of Bulgarian farmers who would go and lay on the train tracks so that the trains could not move to deport the Jews. So the question was, why, if they were an allies of the Nazis, why, if they were an anti-Semitic country, why would they not allow the Jews to be deported? The reason is because the Bulgarian people and that particular person in the parliament at the time did not look at them as Jews first. They looked at them as Bulgarian citizens, and they were not going to allow their own citizens to be sent away to be murdered by the Nazis. The third country I want to point out is the country of Albania, a small little country right there under Yugoslavia. Albania, as it was at the time, as it is today, is the only predominantly Muslim country in Europe. It had a population of about 870,000 Jews. It had a population of about 75% of the population were Muslim, about 24.9% were Christian, and about 0.01% were Jews. About 200 Jews lived there. First country to occupy them were the Italian fascists, and everything was kind of okay at that time while they were occupied by the Italians. But the Italians pulled out, and the Germans came in. But what the Albanian government had done, because they saw what was happening in Germany and the laws that had been into effect, they went to all the Jewish homes and they gave every single Jewish person false identity papers, giving them the names either of a Muslim or a Christian family. So that if they were ever stopped and asked for their identity papers, it would not look like a Jewish name on there. People began to hear about this, and a term that we don't look at as very nice in this country, or haven't recently, were refugees coming from other countries into Albania. They came from Yugoslavia. They even came as far away as Germany if they had relatives there. Ended up 2,200 other Jewish refugees came into Albania. And Albania took every single one of them in and did the same thing with them that they did with their own Albanian citizens. They gave them false identity papers. They hid them out on their farms. They hid them out in the mountains so that the Nazis could not find them. Only one family, because of a mistake, was caught and was murdered by the Nazis in Albania. So why did the Albanians, this mostly Muslim country, do what they did during World War II for the Jews? It's because of a word, and that word is B-E-S-A, Besa, and it is something that is as important as religion is to them. Besa is an honor code, and that honor code says that you will take care of the stranger as if he is your own family. As a matter of fact, you will take care of him more than your own family. If it is a choice between giving up a life of a family member or the stranger, you would give up the family member, and that's what they did. And that's why over 2,200 Jews were saved by the Albanian government because of that word and what they felt. Another country that is not on here, but I think it's important to mention, is in Northern Africa, the country of Morocco. Morocco had a population of about 250,000 Jews, and the Nazis eventually occupied Morocco. And when the Nazis ordered the king and the government of Morocco to turn over a list of the names of the Jews, the king was said to have replied, "There are no Jews here. There are no Muslims. There are only Moroccans." And they refused to give over the names of the Jewish population. Now, luckily, as you know, the Allies invaded North Africa and liberated Morocco before they had a chance to do anything that they could to the Jews. But the fact that the Moroccans were willing to save those Jews in the first place, I think, is a very important question. As you look at the countries on there and the number of people who were murdered, you have to ask, what were the other countries doing? Why is it that those three countries and Morocco were willing to risk their lives and their citizens to risk their own lives to save Jews, and yet 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust in those countries that you see there? That's something that psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists have been studying for years about what would be inside of people to make them do something like that. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's a very important thing. 6 million Jews, as I said, the estimates are of how many Jews died. That's the same number of people who live in Oklahoma, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Vermont today. See a map of the states that I just pointed out. So imagine driving up from Texas, down from Kansas, across from Arkansas, or across from New Mexico, not seeing a single living human being here in the state of Oklahoma. Those are the kind of numbers that we're talking about. Why? Simply because of who they were. Not because of anything that they did economically, not because of anything they did culturally, not because of anything they did religiously, because the Nazis didn't even look at the Jews as a religion. They looked at them as a race of people that they felt were inferior and that needed to be removed from the earth. How did it start? It started first with what were called labor camps, where Jews were sent to work camps, labor camps, and put to work 12 hours a day at hard labor, doing all kinds of things. These people are loading bricks or rocks and boulders onto that thing that would then be pushed to their destination. Notice the uniforms that they have on, everybody, every Jew, and you can see the person that's facing us. If you see the little mark on his outfit right there, that is a Star of David. Because of the outfits, if anybody escaped and people saw them in a uniform like that, they would know that they had escaped from a labor camp, and they would be turned in or killed. Women also were sent to the labor camps, hard work. The only difference is they're not wearing pants, they're wearing skirts with those long jackets there. But it's the same thing that they work those same hours of hard labor during that time. I want to point this one out to you. This is a camp in Austria, concentration camp called Mauthausen. What you see there are Jews coming from the bottom down there, which is a quarry. And what you see them doing is those Jews are marching up 186 steps with anywhere from a 50 to 100-pound rock that they had to carry on their backs up those steps. And one of the favorite pastimes of the Nazi guards would be, they would be on the ridges on both sides of those steps there, and they would pick out a Jew near the top and they would shoot him. So you know what would happen? It's like a bowling ball. The person would fall and knock other people off of those steps and they would fall to their death. That was their favorite pastime to do. Those were the conditions that the Jews were living under and working in those camps. Now, the estimates are that the Jews in the labor camp and the ghettos, somewhere between 1 million Jews died in the labor camps and in the concentration camps and in the ghettos from starvation, from malnutrition, because of the small quarters that they were confined to. An example would be the Warsaw Ghetto, that anywhere from 10 to 18 people were housed, not in a single apartment, but in a single room together. The rations for food was somewhere between 240 and 400 calories a day for each person. Because of the filth and how many people were living there in such a small quarantined area, the whole ghetto had about 360,000 Jews in it in a 1.2 square mile area. So it was very difficult to keep it clean. So what happened was typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid broke out in the ghettos, and hundreds of thousands of them perished. Then the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. They broke treaty that they had, and the Nazis ran through the Soviet Union. And following the army that the Nazis sent into the Soviet Union was a special group of people called the Eisenstattengruppen. And what they would do is they would go into every town, every city, and every village and round up every single Jew. And they would take them to the outskirts of those towns, the cities, and villages, take them to ditches that had been dug, and they would shoot them. The estimates are that the Nazis murdered about somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million Jews by shooting them to death and burying them in mass graves. But that caused two problems for the Nazis. The two problems that it caused was, the first problem was they were using a lot of bullets to murder Jews, and they were in the middle of a war. The second problem that it caused, believe it or not, no matter how bigoted, no matter how anti-Semitic, no matter how much you hated the Jews, when your only job 8 hours a day is to go into every town, every city, every village, and round up every Jew, from a small baby in a hospital or in a house to the oldest senior citizen, and march them to the outskirts of town and shoot them dead, it began to have a morale problem on those soldiers. So the Nazis were very creative. They came up with something else called mobile killing vans, where they would take a van like that and drive it to the outskirts of the town, the village, the city, and they would bring anywhere from 40 to 80 Jews at a time, depending on the size of the van. They would leave the van running, they would pack the Jews in, they would close the door and seal it, and then they would run a hose from the exhaust of the running van and feed it back inside of the van. No longer had to use bullets to murder Jews, and you no longer had to look at the faces of the people you were murdering. But there was one detail that the Nazis didn't like about this process, and that was it took anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours for every Jew to be dead. And that wasn't fast enough for the Nazis. So the Nazis, again, were very creative, and they came up with something else that they had actually started using on some other people. It's important to understand that the Jews were not the first victims of the Holocaust. German people were. The Nazis, when they came into power in 1933, one of the first things they did is made sure they had a list of the entire population of Germany. And they went through those lists and found every single person that they considered was disabled in some way, either mentally or physically. And they went to the families and they told them that we are going to take your relative. It could be a father, a mother, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, and we're going to take them and we're going to house them in an institution where we will take care of them so you don't have to worry about them anymore. And they rounded up those people and took them to institutions, and they started a euthanasia program, and they actually started murdering their own people. When people would go there to visit their relatives, there was always an excuse of why they couldn't see their relative at that time. But they started adding two and two together and started figuring out what was going on. And there was such an outcry in Germany that they had to stop the program. Eventually, they started it up again, but started doing it a lot quieter. So how did they do it? They started experimenting with those pellets right there, Zyklon B, which was a form of poison. That is a group of women who were brought to one of the extermination camps. The thing you can notice about them immediately is the fact that they're all bald. Their heads were shaved. The reason that their heads are shaved is because it was so filthy in the camps that lice would break out. And lice spread like wildfire. So the Nazis were not concerned about the lice affecting the Jews, but they were concerned about it affecting the guards, the German guards who were over them. So they would shave the heads. They would take their hair, that's hair from those women there, that's also their hair, which has been bagged up, which would be sent back to Germany, where it would be washed and cleaned, and then they would use it to make comforters, the stuffing for pillows. And eventually they even started using the hair to make thread that would be used in making armaments, bombs. So the Nazis had the plan, and that's when they began the process of exterminating the Jews. They would bring them to one of the 6 facilities that they had set up, which were known as extermination camps, which were very different than the concentration camps. If you died in a concentration camp or a labor camp, that was okay, because they were using them, though, for labor. Extermination camps were set up for one reason, and that was to exterminate the Jews. 6 camps were set up. All of them were in Poland because they didn't want to do that extermination on their own land. The camps that you know about, the most famous of them is Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the estimates are over 1.2 million people were murdered, of which the estimates are about 900,000 of them were Jews who were murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The others were Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Belzec. After long train rides, what the Nazis would do is bring the Jews into a large room and tell them, after the long train trip of anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, that they were going to get a hot shower. They even told the Jews when they brought them to these places, when they took off their clothes, to make sure as a family you kept your clothes folded neatly together or all put on a single hook. So when you came out of the shower, you could find your clothes very easily. The showers were about the size of a little bit bigger than a classroom. What the Nazis would do would stuff anywhere from 350 to 500 people at a time inside of those rooms. The first thing that you noticed and that they noticed as the parents were carrying their small children, grandparents holding on to the hands of their small grandchildren, when they got inside, see shower heads. And that's what they saw, expecting the water to be turned on. But instead, the doors were closed and they were sealed. And on the outside would be two Nazi soldiers wearing gas masks, or in the ceiling, where there was a steel slat across the ceiling or across the door. And they would slide that open, and they would then drop in the Zyklon B poison. Zyklon B poison works in this way. The hotter it is in an area, the faster the poison is given off. So with that many people stuffed into a room, every single Jew would be dead within 20 minutes. The Nazis then would exhume the gas out, and then people would go in and take the bodies, and they would examine them one last time for any valuables that may have been hidden. And then they would take the bodies, where they would put them on those steel slats there and shove them into the ovens in the crematorium, where they would burn the bodies. After thousands of bodies had been burned, they would actually go in and scoop up the ashes. And the ashes would be combined, because your body has all kinds of minerals and stuff inside of it. And they would combine it with other chemicals to make fertilizer. So it started with the hair, and then finally with the very ashes of the bodies that they burned, simply because they were Jews, for no other reason. And that's where the estimates of the 6 million come up and how they got them. And before anybody thinks that when the Nazis first came into power that they immediately started murdering the Jews, that's not how it happened at all. It started with the simple acts of harassment and bullying, trying to make people feel like they were inferior human beings simply because of who they were. This is a prime example, where they would make the Jews come out to wash the streets, and you can see what they're washing them with: small brushes. You can see a mother brought her small little son there to watch what was going on. Sometimes they gave the Jews nothing more than a toothbrush to clean the streets with. You can see the huge crowds that are gathering there to watch. And if they didn't think you were doing it fast enough or well enough, they would either shoot you dead right there, or they would pick you up and take you away to jail. Again, simply because you were a Jew, for no other reason. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of others were murdered in the same way that the Jews were. They included, as I mentioned before, the physically and mentally handicapped, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses was the only other religious group that were persecuted by the Nazis. Why were they persecuted? Because there were about 25 to 30,000 Jehovah's Witnesses who lived in Germany. And two things under the Nazis you showed your allegiance to. One was to Adolf Hitler. And of course, the way you did that, when you were walking down the street, if a Nazi soldier went by, you gave the Heil Hitler sign, where you stick your arm up in the air. And the second, to show your allegiance to Germany, Nazi Germany, was you would fly a Nazi flag outside of your home or your business. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to do either of those things, because, as they said, they give their allegiance only to one entity, and that was to God. Over 18,000 Jehovah's Witnesses males were rounded up and interned in the camps, where about 12,000 of them were murdered by the Nazis in the same way that the Jews were. They also included the Roma and the Sinti, commonly referred to as gypsies, ethnic groups that traveled around Eastern and Western Europe, and they were looked at as asocial, and that they were bad for the German people to be in the country. So they rounded up the Roma and the Sintis and murdered them in the same way. Also included communists and socialists, obviously because of the political philosophy of them. They included Freemasons, and they included priests and pastors and bishops who spoke out from their pulpits about what was going on. We don't know the total numbers there, but it's, as I said, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them. That is a picture of a group, Roma, who were taken to Treblinka extermination camp. None of the people that you see there in that picture survived the war. They were all murdered in the gas chambers, and then their bodies were burned. November 1932. Why is that an important date? That's an important date because that is the last time that there was a free democratic election held in the democratic country of Germany. Everybody knew what the Nazis stood for and what they were going to do. Adolf Hitler had written about it in his book Mein Kampf, that he was going to murder the Jews, exterminate the Jews and the Slavic people. And in that election, the Nazis did not win the majority. They only got something like 32.3% of the vote. But it was enough for them to combine with other right-wing parties to come into power, where they proceeded to elect Adolf Hitler as the chancellor. So January 30th, 1933, the Nazi Party comes into power in Germany. You can see again the Nazi salute there. You can see the swastika flags going by. The interesting thing about this picture is those are not soldiers. Those are not older people. Those are young kids, age 12 to 18. All of them males who had to belong to the Nazi Youth Party, where they would immediately be indoctrinated into Nazi culture and philosophy, especially about the Jews. Girls had their own organization. What they taught the young women and the young girls was home economics, how to cook, how to bake, how to take care of a home, everything that a homemaker would do. Because while the males, when they turned 18, would go into the army, the military, the young women were being trained to do one thing, and that was to produce more babies for the German army. That was the situation in Nazi Germany. And so many of you are librarians here. I doubt if there's a person on there that you don't know who it is. Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, H.G. Wells, Ernest Hemingway, Jack Lord, Helen Keller, Upton Sinclair, Sinclair Lewis. The one thing that they all have in common is they were all authors. And on May 10th, 1933, young people, older people, walked into libraries, public libraries all across Nazi Germany, and proceeded to remove the books by those people that I just showed you there, and hundreds and thousands of other authors, both German and non-German. And they took those books to the center of their towns and cities and villages, and they burned those books because the Nazis said those books were not in their tradition and philosophy and the culture of the Nazi Party, especially for young people. The important thing here to remember is 108 years before a single Jew was sent to the gas chamber and burned in the crematorium because of something else that was going on in Europe at the time and in Germany. A very famous German poet and philosopher, following quote, "Where one burns bodies, one will in the end burn people," said by Heinrich Heine in 1833. 108 years later, that came to fruition. That was Nazi Germany. I doubt if there are too many books on there that you don't know. Harry Potter series, the Twilight series, 50 Shades of Grey. Until We Meet Again is the book that I wrote about my parents' experience during the Holocaust. The thing that all of those books or series of books have in common is all of them in some library system across the country or in school system has been banned because they didn't like what they were about. Someone who was running for the primary in 2012 trying to get the presidency on the Republican side tried to get Aladdin and the Lion King banned from schools, predominantly elementary schools, because this person didn't feel it was appropriate for them to see this. And that's why I tell students too, it starts with simple things of trying to ban something or segregate something. Oklahoma tried to do that, and they did do that in our state, where they segregated certain books, if you remember a few years back. It's very important that we make sure that that never happens again, especially in any library, because believe it or not, we have a choice. And the choice is this: don't go in and check the book out. It's that simple. And that's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us today. In 1935, the Nazis passed two laws called the Nuremberg Laws, culmination of what those laws did is they defined who a citizen of Germany could be. That they said was no intermarriage between Germans and Jews, denied the use of public transportation. Jews were denied the right to vote. Jews could only live in designated areas. Jews could not eat in German restaurants. Jews could not stay in German hotels. Jews were denied access to state colleges and universities. Jewish students could not attend public school with German students. Jews had curfews. That's a Jewish woman sitting on a bench in Munich, and it says Nur für Juden, which is only for Jews. That's a sign up there at a small little village in Germany that says, "You do not welcome here, find somewhere else." If those laws sound familiar to something else that you've studied, you're exactly right. The Jim Crow laws in the United States of America. No intermarriage between African Americans and coloreds, as they were referred to at the time, and whites. African Americans had to ride in the back of a bus. African Americans were denied the right to vote. African Americans could not live in white areas. African Americans could not eat in white restaurants. African Americans could not stay in white hotels. African American students could not attend public school with white students. African Americans could not be in white areas after sunset. That is a picture you can see one of them holding up the Confederate flag there. That was a grandmother who took her kids into a diner to get food. Believe it or not, there was supposed to be a table in front of them, but when they came in and sat down, they removed the table and refused to wait on them. Albany, Georgia, that's a library. That's a 14-year-old young black girl who was being escorted out of the library because she dared to go in to check out a book. Adolf Hitler looked around the world and saw those laws in the United States and modeled the Nuremberg laws after them. And the Nazis would ask, "How can you criticize us for the laws we have against the Jews when you have those very same laws in your country against a large portion of your own population?" And that's why we can never allow any law to be passed in this country that takes away the rights or privileges from any individual or groups simply because we don't like who they are or what they stand for. Because once you do that, it's like with books. You're only a step away from allowing it to happen to somebody else, and then another group and another, until finally the group that it's happening to are the very people that are watching or going to watch this today. We've seen it happen too many times before in the world. We've seen it happen too many times before in this country. And that's why what happened to my parents is important to each of us who are watching this today. Eventually, the Nazis said that all Jews would have to start wearing a Star of David to identify them, so everyone would know who the Jews were, from the youngest to the oldest, so that everyone would know who the Jews were. And they were open game for anybody to do anything they wanted to them. If you look where the A is down there on the map, right there, you will see the town of Prubyszow in Poland. It was right near the Soviet border in eastern Poland, on the western border of the Soviet Union. That was a town of about 20,000 people. Of that population, about 55%, about 11,500 were Christians, and about 45%, about 8,500 were Jews. That is the town where both of my parents were born and raised. That's a picture of the only picture I have of my dad's family. That's his father and his mother sitting there, his three sisters, two aunts in the back row, and the back there is one of my dad's two brothers. And the person on your right there, that is my dad. That is him there, and that was about a year before the war started, when he was about 15 and a half years old. My dad's father owned a couple of mills in the area, and because of that, all the farmers in the area, whether they were Christians or Jews, would bring their goods to him to process so they could take it to market to sell. Their hay, their wheat, their barley. And because of that, my dad's father got to know a lot of non-Jews very well. Three of them who play a very important part in my parents' story. One of them was this young Christian Polish farmer, young man by the name of Joseph Wisniewski, a real happy-go-lucky person. And he would come and hang out at the mill with my dad's father, and they became good friends. My dad got to know him real well, so well that my dad used to let him go to his farm and help him with his chores. The reason Joseph Wisniewski was such a happy-go-lucky person is because he always had a pint of vodka in his pocket. So he was always happy and ready to go. Meanwhile, on my mother's side of the family, oh, by the way, if you added up all the family members from the grandparents down to the distant cousins, the Korenblit family had about 40 members of the family. That's a picture of my mom's family. I don't have any picture that have her parents in it. That's only one of three that we have. My Mom came my dad's immediate family was six, two other brothers and then three sisters, and his mom and dad. My mom's family came from an immediate family of her mother, father, three sisters, three other sisters, and three brothers, and an elderly sick aunt who lived with them. That's a picture of them, one of the few pictures that I have of them. One there, you'll see my mom right there. That's about 2 years before the war started, when she was about 13 and a half years old. My mom's father was a handyman, a bricklayer, a builder. That's what he did before the war. If you added up all my mom's family, from the grandparents down to the distant cousins, it came to about 40 people, were scattered around Poland. My dad's family was scattered throughout Poland and right across the border in Western Soviet Union. So my mom's father was a handyman, a bricklayer, a builder. My mom and dad met when they were in elementary school. They were about 8 or 9 years old. My mom will tell you to the day that she passed away in April of 2008 that the minute she laid eyes on him, she knew that that was the person she wanted to be with for the rest of her life. My dad, meanwhile, with the male egos that we've got, said, yeah, she was cute. He liked being around her, but he liked looking at all the other young girls. But eventually the two of them became boyfriend and girlfriend. And that was the situation on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland. Within a very short time period, the Nazis initiated the same laws in Poland and in their hometown that they had initiated on the Jews in Poland and in Czechoslovakia and Austria, that they had taken over without a shot being fired. Then the Nazis did something else. They started dividing the Jews up into ghetto areas. But because of the number of Jews and how they were scattered around, they ended up making 3 ghetto areas. So my dad's house was in one ghetto area. My mom's house was in another ghetto area. Then there was a third ghetto area. My dad's father became concerned for his 2 older sons, who were 18 and 36 months older than my dad. Not that he thought they were going to be killed, but he was afraid that they may be sent into the military or sent away to work. So he sent them across the border into the Soviet Union to stay with relatives there. But because of my dad's age, I thought it was better for him to stay there. And plus, he had his girlfriend there that he really didn't want to leave. So that was the situation. They were confined in the ghettos. You could not be out of the ghetto unless you got permission from the Nazis. And then all Jewish males between the ages of 13 and 65 would have to go out and work for the Nazis from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock in the evening at hard labor. The only day you had off was on Sunday. And while you think that's fine, you know, that's the day you go to church and you have family time and stuff. Of course, to the Jewish people, the holiest day is Saturday, the Sabbath. So not only were they living under the most dehumanizing conditions, but they were being forced to break what they felt was God's commandment to them of not working on the Sabbath. So every day my dad and his father with their group had to go out and did a work assignment. Usually it was building roads or working in the brick factories. So my dad was never able to see his girlfriend. So he waited one night until he was sure his parents were asleep, and he proceeded to sneak out of his house, avoided the Nazi guards, snuck out of his ghetto, under the fence, the barbed wire fence, went around the city, snuck under the barbed wire fence into my mother's ghetto, and would sneak into her house so he could spend the evening there with her. He would then get up very early the next morning and sneak back the same way so that he would be there in time to go to work with his father the next day. Because if he didn't, then his parents would have been punished. When I say punished, I mean taken out, and they would have been shot. They did that every night so that he could be there with her. Then the Nazis began to do something else. They began to round up small groups of Jews, usually the doctors, the lawyers, the rabbis, the teachers, and they would take them away. Small groups of 20, 25 at a time. When anybody ever asked where they were being taken, they were always informed that they were being resettled in another part of Poland. So one Saturday night, my dad made the decision that he wanted to see where the Nazis were taking these Jews. And he told his girlfriend, my mom, that he was going to sneak out and not stay that night because he wanted to see where the Nazis were taking these Jews. And my mom said she wanted to go with him. So they took off their armbands with the Star of David on. And my dad, being the little sneak that he was, snuck the two of them out of the ghetto and out of the city to the outskirts of town, where they waited about a mile outside of the city away from the road so they wouldn't be seen. And sure enough, about mid-morning, the Nazis came marching down the road with some Christian Poles who were collaborating with the Nazis and about 20 Jews. And they followed at a safe distance so they wouldn't be seen until the Nazis left the road and went into this open field. And my mom and dad went into this little forest area and laid down in the brush so they wouldn't be seen. And they watched as the Nazis marched those 20 Jews up to two large holes that had been dug in the ground. And they watched as they made the Jews take off their clothes and then proceeded to shoot them and throw them into those holes. And then they watched as the Nazis and the Polish Christians who were collaborating with them fill up those holes with dirt. And to the day that my mom passed away, as I said, in April of 2008, and my dad in June of 2012, whenever they talked to anybody about their experience in the Holocaust, they said this was the one thing that never left their mind, that they never forgot. And that was, after those holes had been filled up with dirt, they could still see the ground moving up and down, because not everybody who had been shot had been killed. And people who were alive were still trying to dig their way from the bodies and the dirt on top of them. Eventually, the ground stopped moving as those Jews died from suffocation. So my mom and dad knew they had to go back and tell their parents about what they had just seen. That very night, my dad snuck his own father out of their house, out of their ghetto, and went to a farm about 2 miles away. And it was the farm of Joseph Wisniewski, that young farmer that they had become friends with years before. Now, they had no idea how Joseph would react to them being there, because Jews and Christians were not allowed to even communicate with each other. And they hadn't seen him in over a year. So they knocked on the door, and he came to the door, and before he even said anything, he grabbed hold of them and started hugging them. And he asked them how they were doing. At which point my dad explained about what he had just seen that day. And then my dad's father looked at Joseph Wisniewski, this young Polish Christian, in the eyes and said, "If the time comes and we need it, would you be willing to help?" Without a moment's hesitation, he said, "Of course." And they left it at that. My dad and his father snuck back to the house, and they left it like that. Meanwhile, my mom's father, who I told you was a handyman, a bricklayer, a builder, when the Nazis found that out, they used him for special assignments, to build things for them, to repair things in their houses where they lived or in their offices. So what they would do is they would take him to his workplace, they would tell him what they wanted done, and they would leave him there on his own. So the first day after my mom told her father what she had seen that day, he got to his work assignment, the Nazis left, and the first thing he did was looked around and found a single brick. And he took the brick and he stuffed it down his pants. Went about his work. 12 hours later, the Nazis came, he put his coat on, and they escorted him back to the ghetto. And the first thing he did when he got into the ghetto, into his house, is he went down to the basement, pulled the brick out, and hid it away. And he kept doing that every single day until he had enough bricks of the same color and same texture as the bricks that had built his basement wall. He left just enough of an opening in the brick wall so that there'd be enough room for each person to lie down on the ground and crawl through to the other side. And he had cemented some bricks onto a rod so that when he crawled through to the other side, he could pull it in front of the opening. He stored some non-perishable food and water back there for when the time might come when they had to go. March of 1942, very late at night, there was a knock on my dad's door, my dad's parents' door. If there is one thing you didn't want to hear late at night, it was a knock on your door in the ghetto being Jewish, because you knew that could only be bad. My dad and his father went and answered the door, and standing there is this young Christian Pole, and they immediately escorted him to the house. His name was Henryk Gorski, and he was the son of a very good friend of my dad's family. And his father had sent him there to warn them, telling them that the next day the Nazis were going to come into the ghettos and they were going to start rounding up thousands of Jews to take them away. How did this young man's father know that? Because he was still in the Polish government. By the way, that's the entrance to my dad's ghetto. When we went back with my parents, the gates and the fences were still up with the barbed wire. And we went back to do research. That was in 1980, and it was still there. The reason that he knew is because Franyak Gorski, their friend, happened to be the chief of police of the city. So he knew exactly what the Nazis were going to do because his own policemen were going to have to help round the Jews up. But what very few people knew is that Franyak Gorski was working with the Polish underground to fight against the Nazis. He had built a hideout in his house. That is his house right there. He was going to hide my dad's parents and his family out until the deportation was over. Before my dad left to go to that hideout, you can imagine what he did. And that was, he snuck out of his house and snuck over to my mom's house in the ghetto to warn her family about what was going to happen. And they went down to the basement hideout where they hid out for 24 hours until it was safe to come back out again. 2 weeks later, knock on the door again. Again, there's Henryk Gorski. But he told him this time it was too dangerous for them to go back to the chief of police's house in case someone had gotten suspicious or had seen something. So this time it was decided that they were going to go to another Christian family's house, a man by the name of John Salkey, that my dad's father was very good friends with. John Salkey was also still in the Polish government, and he was working with the chief of police, with the Polish underground. He was actually the commissioner of roads there. So he was responsible for the work assignments that the Jews got. But again, nobody knew that he was working with the chief of police, with the Polish underground. So that second time, he had built a hideout in his attic where he hid my dad's family out. Meantime, my dad went once again to warn my mom's family. Only this time, the elderly aunt who was sick before the war even started, and with lack of food, lack of medicine, she had said, no, I'm too tired, I'm too weak, I'm too sick to go down. If they want to take me, let them take me. So my mom and the rest of her brothers and sisters ended up going beside the bed and kissed their aunt goodnight. That was the last time they ever saw her alive again. The Nazis came into the house the following day, found her lying there in the bed, and they took her away. They took the Jews down to the train station where they packed them into cattle cars. The Jews of my parents' hometown of Hrubieszów were taken to a place called Belzec. Belzec was one of the 6 extermination camps, where they were immediately sent to the gas chambers, and then their bodies were burned in the crematorium. Now, the estimates are that Jews had lived in this area of Poland, in their hometown in that area, for about 300 to 350 years. 3 weeks later, knock on the door again. Only this time, it was not Henryk Gorski. This time, it was the son of the Commissioner of Roads, John Salkey, who had hid him out the second time. It was his son, Janek Salkey. Now, the important thing about Janek Salkey was, Janek Salkey wasn't some 21, 22-year-old man like Henryk Gorski. Janek Salkey was 13 years old. He knew what the risk was, and yet he snuck into the ghetto to warn my dad and his family that this was going to be the last deportation of all the Jews, the last 2,000. Which meant that in a matter of less than 2 months, the Nazis were wiping out any existence of any Jew having lived in this area of Poland, where Jews had been for over 350 years. So they knew this was the time that they had to go to Joseph Wisniewski's, who had said he would be willing to help them over a year before. As my dad's mom was getting his little sisters ready to go, my dad looked at his father and said, I have to go see my girlfriend one more time. And his dad said, he literally looked at him and said, are you crazy? Have you lost every ounce of brains you have in your head? The Nazis have encircled the entire city waiting for any Jew to escape, and you want to go see your girlfriend again. And he said, I promise you, I will meet you at Joseph's. And with that, he slipped out and made it to her house one more time. And needless to say, my mom was very excited when she saw him coming into the house, but she said, what are you doing here? Because they were getting ready to go down to the basement hideout because everybody knew what was going to happen the next day. And he said, I had to see you one more time. And then he looked at her and he said, I want you to come with me, hide with me. And then he said, I want all of you to come. And her father thought about it for a moment. And then he said, no. He said, we've been safe here twice before. We'll be safe here again. Why don't you stay with us? And because he wanted to be with his girlfriend, he thought about it for a moment. Then he said no, because of the promise he made to his father. And he knew that if he didn't show up, his father and mother would think that he had gotten caught. So he looked at her again and said, please come with me. and she didn't know what to do. And the next thing that happened was the most incredible thing that any human being could possibly do. Her mother took her in her arms and said, "It's okay. Go with him. Maybe if we're separated, some of us will have a better chance to survive." And what her mom was hoping is that she was sending her daughter to life. But the one thing she was almost assured of is that she was probably never, ever going to see her young daughter ever again. And my mother made the decision to go with her boyfriend. And just as they were about to leave, they turned around and looked at my mom's 14-year-old brother, and she and he were very close brother and sister, and said, "Please come with us." And Chaim said, "Yes, I want to go." Now here's a mother who just gave up her daughter, knowing she'd probably never see her again, but felt she could do no less for her son. And she took Chaim in her arms, hugged him, and said, "Go with your sister." When they left, that would be the last time they ever saw their mother, their father, and the rest of their brothers and sisters alive again. They ran out of water 3 days later. My mom's father snuck out of the ghetto to get water for his family. Somebody recognized him, knew he was a Jew, followed him back to the ghetto to see where his house was, and then went to the Gestapo headquarters to turn him in for the reward. The Nazis went to the house, they searched it, and finally found them hiding in the basement hideout, where they took them out and marched them to the outskirts of town, where they shot them dead and buried them in a mass grave. Meanwhile, my mom, my dad, and Chaim have made it to Yosef's farm. Now, what did this young farmer do? Well, the last time he harvested his hay, he decided he would build himself a haystack at the back of his farm. And he kept building it until it was about 10 or 11 feet high. It was a haystack like that. And he went out one night and he proceeded to dig the inside of the haystack out so that there would be enough room for his family to live inside of there. And for over 2 weeks, they hid inside of that haystack, only coming out late at night or early in the morning when at risk to their own lives. Josef Wisniewski, the Polish farmer, John Salkey, the commissioner of roads, or Franiak Gorski, or Henryk Gorski, the chief of police, and his son would bring them food every single night. They would go outside, get some fresh air, use the bathroom, and wait for another 23 hours and 30 minutes. Until finally, Henryk Gorski told them that the Nazis were no longer looking for Jews. Instead, they were bringing Jews back because they needed them for work in the ghetto. But they didn't want old Jews and they didn't want young Jews. So it was decided that my mom and dad would go in with Chaim because he thought he could help his family better from there. When my dad left the haystack that night, that would be the last time he ever saw his parents again. Chief of police told him about another large ghetto that was still in existence, so they thought they would go there. They ended up going, got on the train in a little village called Mislovich. The train finally stopped in their hometown of Hrubieszov. The train started to take off, and then it stopped. Somebody got on in their hometown who recognized them as being Jews and turned them in to the Gestapo on the train, where they took them off and shot them dead there. Meanwhile, my mom, my dad, Chaim, my mom's best friend Tova were in the camp in the ghetto together. And one day the Nazis decided they had too many Jews and not enough work, and they made a selection. And one of the Jews who was selected of that 200 Jews, of the 100 Jews, was her brother Chaim. And that would be the last time she saw her brother as he was taken away. 2 months later, with no warning at all, they took my mom and dad and Tova and the rest of the Jews, packed them into 2 cattle cars, and sent them on their way. They put a bucket in that cattle car if you had to use the bathroom, which many people had to because of the long train trip. That first trip they took them to was a place called Budzin, was the first camp they were to be in, which would be the first of 13 concentration, labor, and extermination camps that my parents would go through over the next 2 years. First there was Budzin, and in that camp, my dad actually found out when they were separated into a men's camp and women's camp, my dad found out where my mother's barrack was. And with the help of his 4 friends that he became good friends with, that he bunked with, he asked if they would cover for him. And they said, of course, pulled the blanket up if they came in unexpectedly to check on how many Jews were there. And my dad proceeded to sneak out of the barrack, avoided the Nazi guards, called under the barbed wire fence of the men's camp, across the open area under the barbed wire fence of the women's camp, found my mother's barrack where he snuck in and would spend the night there with her. Then he got up very early the next morning and would sneak back the same way so that he was there in time for roll call the next day. And he did that every night so he could be with her. And then one night while he was lying there, he said, "Make me a promise." And she said, "Of course. Promise me that if something happens and we're separated after the war, you will meet me back in our hometown." And she said, of course. 2 weeks later, the Nazis came into the women's camp, rounded them up, and took them away. And that would be the last time in about 18 months that my mom and dad would see each other. My mom went on to 4 more camps with four other young women that she became very close friends with, including her best friend, Tova Bornstein. She was taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and it was in Auschwitz-Birkenau that she learned that her brother had been brought there and that he had been taken away the day before she got there. And a friend saw him being led away to the gas chambers. My mom, and she weighed 65 pounds. Meanwhile, my dad had gone through 7 more camps with his 4 buddies. And with everything that they had gone through, they knew that there was nowhere they were going to make it when the Nazis decided to take them on a death march, because the Allies were closing in on Germany. And what they would literally do is take the Jews out of the camps and walk them to death. So on the second night of that death march, and they decided that night that they would try and get away. And they waited until it was completely dark. There was a light drizzle, and they crawling along the ground for about 100 yards before they jumped up and started running, and finally made their way to this barn where they went inside totally exhausted. They were awoken the next morning by this dog barking and somebody singing. And one of my dad's friends went and peeked out, and sure enough, it was the German farmer coming to do some chores in his barn. So they knew they had to hide, so they buried themselves underneath the hay. And finally, they heard the door open. They felt the dog running around on top of them, that they had buried themselves underneath the hay. Well, the first chore that the farmer had to do was pitch some hay for his livestock. So he immediately picked up the pitchfork, stuck it into the hay, and sure enough, stuck one of my dad's friends right in the leg. He jumped up and yelled. The farmer's so shocked he yelled. And then my dad and his other 3 friends jumped up out of the hay and they yelled. And they're all staring at each other. And they explained who they were. And the farmer said, "Wait here." They had no choice. It was daytime. They had those uniforms on with the Star of David. It was broad daylight, so if anybody saw them, they would know they were Jews. So they had to trust him. 20 minutes later, he came back with a basket of food and some water, but told them they had to leave the next day. And they promised that they would, because he said, if the Nazis found you here and thought I was helping you, they'll kill me and my family. That night, they slipped out of the barn, walked 10 feet, and said, "Where are we going?" They had no idea where to go, if they were going to walk into the Nazis or if they were going to walk into the Allies. So they decided to give it another good night's sleep. And the next morning, they were awoken by this rumbling sound. And one of my dad's friends again went and peeked out the door. And they said, "What is it? What is it?" And he couldn't talk. And there were tears coming down his face. And so my dad and his other 3 buddies looked out the door. And when my dad described this to me, when we were doing research for the book, he said he had only seen this one other time before in his life. And he had seen it in a book in school. And what he saw were trucks and Jeeps coming down the road with American flags on them. My dad and his friends were liberated by the American forces. When my dad was liberated, he was 5'10". He was not quite 21 years old, and he weighed 78 pounds. My parents' story is the story about 3 miracles. The first is that they even survived at all, when 3/4 of European Jewry were murdered. Second miracle is the fact that they found each other after the war. My dad went back into Poland to get my mom out and bring her out. He went back to their hometown. And the third miracle happened 39 years later, when I was doing research on the book. And I ended up finding my mom's brother, Chaim, who we thought had died in Auschwitz-Birkenau, alive and well and living in Newcastle, England. And on January the 30th, 1981, we took an airline, a British Airways airline, to Newcastle, England, and 11:01 British time, her mother and her brother saw and touched each other for the first time. I don't know if any of you know any of the names that are on that list, but you should, and I'm not criticizing you for not. Every school kid in Oklahoma should know everybody's name on that list. When I was 7 years old, my dad came home from work, did what he always did when he came home from work, turned on the television, sat down in his favorite chair, and turned on the news. That night, he saw something on that August night that really bothered him, and he kept following it in the newspaper and on television until he had his first day off, was the following Saturday. He worked a half a day. He came home. I was playing in the backyard, and he yelled at me, "Mike, come on, I want to take you for a ride with me and your mom." We went and got in the car, and my dad drove me to a park in Ponca City. Oh, by the way, I'm from Ponca City, Oklahoma. Parked the car. We got out and walked into the park, and my dad walked me up to a water fountain, and he asked me to take a drink out of it on this hot August day. And I did, and he said, "How did that taste?" And I said, "Great, cold water on a hot August day. What can be better than that?" And my dad asked me, his 7-year-old son, to read the sign on the water fountain to him. And I did, and it said, "Whites only." They then walked me to a water fountain not 10 feet away, and he asked me to take a drink out of it. And I did. And once again, he asked, how did that taste? And I said, the same as the water that I just drank over there. And again, he asked me to read the sign to them. And I did. And it said, coloreds only. Without saying a word, we walked back to the car, and my dad proceeded to drive us down to the bus station. He parked the car. We got out and walked in. Nice area, ceiling fans going on this hot August day, nice chairs there where people were sitting waiting for the bus to come. And my parents walked me up to this podium, and there was a sign on it, and the sign said, white waiting area. My mom then walked me to the back of the bus station. Not so nice area. No ceiling fans, hot, sweaty area, broken chairs. Now, the thing that I need to mention to you is the fact that all of my mom's immediate family, except for Chaim, who we found much later, but we thought he had died, and my dad's whole family, except for one brother, who we found out later too that he had survived in the Russian army, along with all of the extended family, had been murdered in the Holocaust. So we got to the back of the bus station, and there was a sign up on the wall, and my dad asked me to read the sign with them, with my mom and dad. And the three of us read the sign together, and it said colored waiting area. And my dad looked at me, his 7-year-old son, and he said, I want you to always remember what I've shown you here today, because that's the reason that you don't have any grandparents and lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, because people looked at them as different and inferior human beings. The story that my dad saw on that day on the news, that hot August day in August in Oklahoma, was a story of these 13 young kids, aged 7 to 16, who on a hot Saturday in August in 1958 were driven to downtown Oklahoma City with their supervisor, a woman by the name of Clara Looper, where they walked into Katz drugstore, sat down at the counter, and ordered 13 Coca-Colas, and were refused service because of the color of their skin. They sat there all day long and waited for their Cokes. People started hearing about it. They started coming in to see what was going on. They closed at 5 o'clock. They got up and left very peacefully. They were the first ones back the next day, sat down at the counter, ordered 13 Cokes. By this time, word spread like wildfire, and people started coming in. They started yelling at them, cussing at them, calling them the N-word, everything else you can think of. But they sat there, didn't say a word. The next day they came back again. Only this time they had removed the stools from the counter, so they had nowhere to sit. So they stood there. People brought in eggs and were cracking raw eggs on their heads. One person even brought a chicken in, a live chicken, and set it on the top of the heads of some of them. And the chicken would start scratching on the top of their heads. And they sat there. Katz Drugstore was owned by a corporation that owned 40 other drugstores in Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. The next day, they sent a letter out to all of their drugstores telling them that you will begin serving your Black customers. That day, they ordered 13 hamburgers and 13 Coca-Colas and were served. The next day, they didn't go back to Katz Drugstore. They went to Brown's department store, where they sat down at the counter and were refused service. But what those 13 young kids that you see the names of the list on there did is they helped change the course of history. Not only in Oklahoma City, not only in this state, but in this country, because they started the sit-in movement in this country. It wasn't college kids in North Carolina that get credit for it the most of the time. It was those 13 young kids aged 7 to 16 who started the sit-in movement, which helped desegregate this country and change the course of history. What you do matters. After the world, including the United States, saw what the Nazis did during the Holocaust, it said, never again would we allow something like this to happen. Never again, President Lyndon Johnson. 1968, Nigeria, over 1 million ethnic Igbos are murdered by their own government as the United States and the world sat back and watched. Richard Nixon, 71, 1 to 2 million Bengalis are murdered by Pakistani government as the world sat back and watched. 1972, under Nixon, Burundi, the Tutsi government murders over 200,000 of its own ethnic Hutu citizens as the world and the United States sat back and watched. Gerald Ford, 75 to 76, over 1 million Cambodians are murdered by their own government, the Khmer Rouge, as the United States and the world sat back and watched. President Jimmy Carter, 77 to 79, another 1 to 2 million Cambodians are murdered by their own government as the United States and the world sat back and watched. Never again, President Ronald Reagan, 1988, Iraq, thousands of ethnic Kurds are murdered by Saddam Hussein and his government, and the United States and the world sat back and watched. President George H.W. Bush, 1989 to 92, Iraq, again, murdered thousands of ethnic Kurds as the United States and the world sat back and watched. 91 to 92, Bosnia in Europe, over 100,000 Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs as the United States and the world sat back and watched. President Bill Clinton, 93 to 95, Bosnia, another 150 to 200,000 Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs. We stopped that one when NATO started bombing Serbia and brought them to the peace table and finally stopped the ethnic cleansing that was going on there. 1998 to 99, Kosovo, 25 to 50,000 ethnic Albanian Muslims are murdered by Christian Serbs. We still don't know the total number there because they are still continuing to dig up bodies of Albanians. 1994, Rwanda, over 800,000 ethnic Tutsi are murdered by their own Hutu government in 93 days. Now, think about this. The Holocaust is considered from September 1st, 1939 to May 8th, 1945, when the Nazis surrendered. 6 million Jews are murdered. We watched in 93 days as almost 1 million people were murdered. The world sat back and watched. And just to give you an idea what that is, that's 8,602 people a day. That's 358 people an hour. That was 6 people every minute were being murdered, and the world sat back and watched. Not with any kind of systematic way. There were no gas chambers. There were no crematoriums to burn the bodies. Most of them were murdered by being beaten to death with clubs, or machetes were used on them. President George W. Bush, 2003 to 2009, the Darfur region of the Sudan, over 700,000 ethnic Sudanese are murdered by their own government, and 1 to 2 million are displaced as the world sat back and watched, including the United States. President Barack Obama, January 20th, 2009, it's not to present, but that was until January 20th of 2017, obviously. In the Darfur region of the Sudan, another 1 million ethnic Sudanese are murdered by their own government, and 2 to 3 million more are displaced. August 2014, Mount Sinjar in Iraq. 50 to 60,000 Yazidis are trapped on a mountain. ISIS is about to commit genocide on the Yazidis, which is a Christian sect in Iraq. And something happened that had never happened before in the history of the world. President Barack Obama ordered the United States Air Force to go in and start bombing. And they stopped a genocide before it ever got started. That's something we can be very proud of. But Barack Obama also has this on his plate. January 2011 to January of 2017, Syria. Over 500,000 civilians, including 55,000 children, were murdered on his watch and on the watch of the United States and the world. Myanmar, where the Rohingya Muslims have ethnic cleansing, if not a genocide, taking place against them by the Buddhist government there. So there is no group, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, that has clean hands in what's gone on in the world. Donald Trump, he has Syria and Myanmar and Darfur, and I didn't put Darfur on there, under his watch in his 4 years. We'll see what President Biden does to try and stop the ethnic cleansing or the genocides that are going on. But that's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each and every one of us here today. Columbine High School was the first in Littleton, Colorado that started mass shootings in schools. When they found out why they did it, they left a tape behind at Columbine High School where they killed 12 students and a teacher before they committed suicide. And in the videotape, they said they did it because they had been bullied in their schools and were looked at as outcasts. Alex, 13 years old, Chesapeake, Virginia. Piper Smith, 13 years old, May 2009. Phoebe Prince, 15 years old, Hadley, Massachusetts. Alex Pinkleton, 17 years old, Long Island. Jeff, 15 years old, Cape Coral, Florida. June of 2005. These are just examples. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they all committed suicide because every one of them had been cyberbullied. They couldn't get away from it at school. It was on their computers. It was on their phones. And if you think those places are far away, then take a look at this one. Ty Fields, 11 years old, Perkins, Oklahoma, May of 2010, committed suicide. This is after his parents had even gone to the school and told them what was going on. And it continued. And he just couldn't take it anymore. And he committed suicide. The estimates are somewhere between 300 and 400 kids, young people, and we don't even know, commit suicide because of bullying every year. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years is important to each of us. The latest statistics show Oklahoma K through 5, 11,114 incidents of bullying were reported. Now this is reported, but the estimates are that less than 50% are even reported. 6th through 8th grade, 18,000. 9th through 12th, 9,500. Over 3 million in the United States of America. This is every day. 160,000 students a day make the decision not to go to school out of fear of being bullied. Every 7 minutes, a young person is bullied in a school. 4% of the time, adults will intervene and stop it. 11% of the times, other students will stop it, which is 3 times more than the adults. But 85% of the time, nobody steps up to stop it. And that's why what happened to my parents is important to each of us in what's going on today. Oklahoma City, April 19th, 1995, the bombing of the Murrah Federal Office Building, where 168 innocent men, women, and children were murdered by Timothy McVeigh, who was a racist, anti-Semite, white nationalist. How do we know that? Because when he was arrested, you all, they found a book on the passenger side of his book called The Turner Diaries, which was an anti-Semitic, racist book. And he had underlined in there about Jews and blacks. If you go to April 18th, 1995, you would have found one hate website on the internet. Today, there are over, when I say over, well over 1,000 hate websites on the internet, including www.gasajewforjesus.com and www.killahomoforgod.com. That's why what happened to my parents is important to each of us today. 15,000 is the number of hate crimes that happen in this country every day. One hate crime takes place every hour in this country. Every day, at least 8 blacks, 3 whites, 3 Jews, 2 Latinos, 2 gays, and 2 Muslims are the victim of a hate crime. They are a cancer that needs to be cut out of our society. That was said in 1935 by Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany. He was referring to the Jews in Germany when he said that. They are a cancer that needs to be cut out of our society. That was said by Representative John Bennett of Sallisaw, Oklahoma, in August of 2014. Who was he referring to? He was referring to the Muslims living in this state and in this country. That's why what happened with my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us today. This one is so important. Also, Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister. The more you tell a lie, the more people will believe it. 1,500,000. That's the number of children that were murdered in the Holocaust. None of the children that you saw in those 3 pictures there survived the Holocaust. They were all murdered by the Nazis. 1,260. That's the number of children aged 5 and under in Africa and Asia who have starved to death while we've been sitting here talking today. And you may say, what does that possibly have to do with the Holocaust? It has everything in the world to do with it, because it says how we look at other human beings when they're a different color, a different ethnicity, a different race, a different religion. And the number 188,000 are the numbers in central Oklahoma of students, of kids who go to bed hungry at night, every night. And the 12,580,000 are the number of children in the United States of America who go to bed hungry at night. That's why what happened to my parents over 80 years ago is important to each of us sitting here today. The picture on the right there is Bailey Almond. She had just celebrated her first birthday when she was murdered in the Murrah bombing. That's probably one of the most famous pictures in this country. Picture on the left is 3-year-old Alan Kurdi. Alan Kurdi was a Kurdish young person who had escaped with his parents from Syria and was taking a boat from Turkey to Greece seeking asylum when the boat capsized and they drowned, including Alan Kurdi there. That is probably one of the most iconic photos that was taken in the last 10 years. That is at the border in the United States of a young girl separated from her parents who had come to the United States seeking asylum. And the picture on the right is a picture of a father and his not quite 2-year-old daughter who drowned in the Rio Grande River when he tried to come here to the United States to seek asylum. That's why what happened to my parents is important to each and every one of us sitting here today. Nuremberg, Germany, 1933. Nazis marching, young men. Charlottesville, Virginia, August 2017. White nationalist, white supremacist neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville with the torches, yelling, "Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." Maurice Stallard, 69, Vicki Lee Jones, probably haven't heard of either of them. But on October 24, 2018, they were murdered by a white nationalist at a Kroger's in Jeffersontown, Kentucky. Why are they so important? Because he went hunting for them. Why? Because the black church that he tried to get into, the doors were locked. So he went hunting for other black people that he could murder. 3 days later, an anti-Semite white nationalist walked into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and murdered 11 Jews as they were praying. That's why what happened to my parents is important to each and every one of us today. It's so important to understand what you do matters every single day of your life and how what you do can affect other people's lives. That is a group of Proud Boys in January of 2020 in Washington, D.C., prior to what happened January 6th. The t-shirt that he's reading says 6MWE. And what that stands for is 6 million wasn't enough, referring to 6 million Jews who had been murdered. This was worn on the Capitol on January 6th at the protest that took place. Somebody wearing a shirt that says Camp Auschwitz, work makes you free. That's why what happened to my parents and all of the others that survived is important to each of us today. I show this picture because this is so important. This is a middle school in Paris, France called École Bizet Michel. Why is that important with those kids there? Because in Paris, France, in 1941, the Nazis made the decision that Jews would have to start wearing the yellow star. And so the schools were informed that Jewish kids would have to start wearing the yellow star in schools, so everyone would know who the Jews were. Those young people that you're looking at right there made the decision about they weren't going to let that happen. So the next day, when the Jewish kids came back to school wearing a Star of David, the entire school was wearing Stars of David. So the Nazis would not know who the Jews were and who the non-Jews were. Those were 12, 13, and 14-year-old kids. I hope that we can learn the lessons from these people.